J.G. Ballard and Ignatius Loyola. Prayers on Fire. We'll begin with repetition and stay with repetition before moving on to more repetition. It would be perverse to speak of the saint Ignatius Loyola and the writer J.G. Ballard as equals, but they share much, not least a contemplative attitude to pain and suffering. Ballard's writings combine coldness and sensuality, nihilism and ecstasy. Loyola's writings combine coldness and sensuality, nihilism and ecstasy. Ballard explores our desires for the end of the world. Loyola explores our desires for the end of the world. Ballard develops themes of an obsessive consciousness devoted to self-destruction, a paradoxically self-creative self-destruction. Loyola likewise. Ballard does all of this with a sense of urgency, for death is always close. Loyola does all this with a sense of urgency, for death is always close. We could go on, and we will. Practicing Christians and Orthodox Ballardians may feel queasy about this highly contrived head-on collision of their writings. And obviously, yes, I have to ignore much in both writers to make this happen. Christians may be appalled by Ballard's violent materialism, and Ballardians may be appalled by the suggestion that Ballard's writings contain a religious element which is not alien to the prayers and spiritual exercises of the Jesuits of all people. As George Bataille observed, the saint turns from the voluptuary in alarm, not knowing that his unacknowledgeable desires are of the same order. The flip side of Bataille's point is that the atheist voluptuary also recoils from their own unacknowledged prayers. Prayer without God or gods seems strange, and so it is, especially in Ballard's case. In his 1973 book Crash, the sacred is explored via materialist mysticism in the collision of things. Metal against metal, desire against desire, glass against skin, against imagination, against chrome, against bone. Crash is hardly a narrative at all, more like a particle accelerator for the psyche, smashing things against things in the desperate hope that a meaningful pattern might, by some unknowable grace, be gifted from the wreckage. And as with prayer, ritual or mantra, much of the heavy lifting is done by repetition. Before exploring that repetition, let's be certain the questions which Ballard are addressing in Crash are questions of the end of the world revelations, mystical union, and an incarnate move beyond human reason. In Ballard's own words, Crash is a kit of desperate measures for use only in an extreme crisis. Crash, of course, is not concerned with an imaginary disaster, however imminent, but with a pandemic cataclysm that kills hundreds of thousands of people each year and injures millions. Do we see in the car crash a sinister portent of a nightmare marriage between sex and technology? Will modern technology provide us with hitherto undreamed-of means for tapping our own psychopathologies? Is this harnessing of our innate perversity conceivably of benefit to us? Is there some deviant logic unfolding more powerful than that provided by reason? Ballard's questions point directly to the core of mysticism. Call it faith or call it a hypothesis for testing, but it's this. Valuable insights inaccessible to reason and the intellect may be attained by self-surrender to an unguessable union, with all the attendant risks of madness and self-destruction. Crash was repelled by many publishers. One rejection note read, "The author is beyond psychiatric help. Do not publish." Ballard interpreted that comment as a sign of, and I quote, "complete artistic success." But if Crash is a symptom of illness, we might rebound to the words of the saint. The servant of God earns half a doctorate through illness. Now, Ballard served no God, but he retained a relationship to the sacred in his hopes for a super-rational, or non-rational, if arguably psychopathological, transcendence. We all have psychopathologies now. As Mark Fisher has pointed out, mental illness is mass-produced. It always was in a way. It's 100 years since Freud suggested that religion is a normalized, mass-produced neurosis. Even if that was true, religion had certain social advantages. People could be neurotic in a cohesive and communitarian way. They were not atomized and flung around the particle accelerator by unknown forces as we are. What seems new is that there are few people now who are not crashing and breaking into patterns of depression, legal and illegal drug dependency, self-harm, suicide, obesity, anorexia, chronic anxiety. We repeat and repeat and repeat these phenomena with such regularity and on such a scale, it's hard to avoid the thought that either people genuinely desire these outcomes, or the process is beyond all human control. In the words of Alfonso Lingus, technological devices are invented and mass-produced and superseded before they can be integrated into the purposes of individuals or groups. The juggernaut of technical progression produces a helplessness of individuals. We do not understand how these forms of destruction of ourselves work. We don't understand how they can be resisted. Because we do not understand, because the massacring and alienating forces of industry, forces which also convert individuals into images of images, are irrational, they appear to us as an evil god inhabiting the machinery of industry. But this god itself is not a spirit, it is wholly material. What is there is the face of a mute idol. That's Alfonso Lingus in his very fine essay, The God of Evil, in Demonic Nihilism and the Fate of Modernity. Ballard's novels offer us carnivals of fragmented psyches, advertising images and rituals of endless consumption. Sexuality is infantile and polymorphous. Aggression is infantile and polymorphous. Individuals exist in a broken, semi-larval stage, but with no future to adapt into. The word nihilism is not out of place here. Many of Ballard's characters are numb, traumatized, aimless, like ghosts trying to crash their way back into any kind of sensation which might reinstate meaning. The repetitive collisions Ballard stages take sensationalism out into the desert of a boredom which becomes hallucinatory, florid. The Marquis de Sade used similar techniques in his writings as he tried to provoke God into existence. Ballard's method, and I think it is a method, involves turning the idol of materialism to face itself, smashing its mute face into its mute face, head on, again and again and again until what? Until something else happens? Until the idol speaks, surrenders, retaliates? I don't know. What is certain is that he seeks everywhere for a decisive connection, a meaningful effect. In roadside fragments of shattered glass, in rainbows of spilled engine coolant, in the scars of paraplegic crash victims. It's only a short journey from Loyola's challenge of finding God in all things. Saint Ignatius Loyola's turn to piety is worthy of note. He was first a military man and was reported to have enjoyed violence until in 1521 he was shattered by the impact of a cannonball. This required the leg to be operated upon, set, rebroken and reset, all without anaesthetic. During this time he was prone to visions of a disembodied being, somewhat like a snake and, quote, exceedingly beautiful, with many things that shone like eyes, but were not eyes. That's from Lacuta, 1995. The serpent image is easy to demonize, but there are echoes of Ezekiel's seraphim, and Loyola's fondness for violence was transformed by trauma. His energies were redirected to penitence, pilgrimage, and repetitive prayer. His advice includes the following maxims. Teach us to give and not to count the cost. Go forth and set the world on fire. Truly, I am in love with suffering, but do not know if I deserve the honour. Whatever you're doing, that which makes you feel most alive, that is where God is. He writes of feeding the fire of God's love with the wood of the cross. This delight in suffering and pain is still with him, but it's taken strange new ways. After his accident, he says, let me see myself as an ulcerous sore running with every horrible and disgusting poison. This marks one clear distinction between Loyola's attitude to the body and that of Ballard. Ballard sees in the scarred and twisted bodies of crash survivors a newborn and higher form of beauty. The second point of distinction is that Ballard allows people full rights of self-vandalism in the drive to self-transformation. Loyola's spiritual masochism allows pain, but resists willful damage to the flesh. He writes, "Concerning the harsh treatment of the body for our Lord's sake, I would say, avoid anything that would cause the shedding even of a drop of blood." The cycles of Loyola's spiritual exercises aim beyond the flesh. As Howard Gray says of the process, the repetitions are efforts to engage mystery, to centre on the depths of riches within revelation. Ignatius himself says, "It is through the instrument of repetition that we go back to our own experience of prayer, to where we moved, so that you may dispose yourself to allow the Creator and Lord to deal directly with you." Direct contact with the sacred. Beyond the accidents of the culture and rationality and religion we've inherited, I think it fair to say that Ballard's materialistic mysticism also aims beyond the flesh, though, unlike Loyola, not towards some preconceived metaphysics of God or spirit. When Ballard describes the logic of blood-soaked instrument panels, the complex geometries of crushed steel, the coronation of wounds, he is gesturing beyond their immediate significance towards a hope for contact with that which transcends these signs. If the connection with that force, that mysterium tremendens, does not materialise, the circuit runs again, and again, and again. A short example of the process would not function. So, let's take a deep breath and dive in. For Vaughan, each crashed car set off a tremor of excitement in the complex geometries of a dented fender, in the unexpected variations of crushed radiator grills, in the grotesque overhang of an instrument panel forced onto a driver's crotch as if in some calibrated act of machine fellatio. The intimate time and space of a single human being had been fossilised forever in this web of chromium knives and frosted glass. Even this first death seemed timid compared with the others in which Vaughan took part, and with those imaginary deaths that filled his mind. Trying to exhaust himself, Vaughan devised a terrifying almanac of imaginary automobile disasters and insane wounds, the lungs of elderly men punctured by door handles, the chests of young women impaled by steering columns, the cheeks of handsome youths pierced by the chromium latches of quarter lights. For him, these wounds were the keys to a new sexuality born from a perverse technology. The images of these wounds hung in the gallery of his mind like exhibits in the museum of a slaughterhouse. Thinking of Vaughan now, drowning in his own blood under the police arc lights, I remember the countless imaginary disasters he describes as we cruised together along the airport expressways. He dreamed of ambassadorial limousines crashing into jackknifing butane tankers, of taxis filled with celebrating children colliding head-on below the bright display windows of deserted supermarkets. He dreamed of alienated brothers and sisters by chance meeting each other on collision courses on the access roads of petrochemical plants, their unconscious incest made explicit in this colliding metal, in the hemorrhages of their brain tissue flowering beneath the aluminized compression chambers and reaction vessels. Vaughan devised the massive rear-end collisions of sworn enemies, hate deaths celebrated in the engine fuel burning in the wayside ditches, paintwork boiling through the dull afternoon sunlight of provincial towns. He visualised the specialised crashes of escaping criminals, of off-duty hotel receptionists trapped between their steering wheels and the laps of their lovers who they were masturbating. He thought of the crashes of honeymoon couples seated together after their impacts with the rear suspension units of runaway sugar tankers. He thought of the crashes of automobile stylists, the most abstract of all possible deaths, wounded in their cars with promiscuous laboratory technicians. Vaughan elaborated endless variations on these collisions, thinking first of a repetition of head-on collisions, a child molester and an overworked doctor reenacting their deaths first in head-on collision and then in rollover. A retired prostitute crashing into a concrete motorway parapet, her overweight body propelled through the fractured windshield, menopausal loins torn on the chromium bonnet mascot. Her blood would cross the over-white concrete of the evening embankment, haunting forever the mind of a police mechanic who carried the pieces of her body in a yellow plastic shroud. Alternatively, Vaughan saw her hit by a reversing truck in a motorway fueling area, crushed against the near side door of her car as she bent down to loosen her right shoe, the contours of her body buried within the bloody mould of the door panel. He saw her hurtling through the rails of the flyover and dying as Vaughan himself would later die, plunging through the roof of an airline coach, its cargo of complacent destinations multiplied by the death of this myopic, middle-aged woman. He saw her hit by a speeding taxi as she stepped out of her car to relieve herself in a wayside latrine, her body whirled 100 feet away in a spray of urine and blood. I think now of the other crashes we visualised, absurd deaths of the wounded, maimed and distraught. I think of the crashes of psychopaths, implausible accidents carried out with venom and self-disgust, vicious multiple collisions contrived in stolen cars on evening freeways among tired office workers. I think of the absurd crashes of neurasthenic housewives returning from their VD clinics, hitting parked cars in suburban high streets. I think of the crashes of excited schizophrenics colliding head-on into stalled laundry vans in one-way streets, of manic depressives crushed while making pointless U-turns on motorway access roads, of luckless paranoids driving at full speed into the brick walls at the ends of known cul-de-sac, of sadistic charge nurses decapitated in inverted crashes on complex interchanges, of lesbian supermarket manageresses burning to death in the collapsed frames of their midget cars before the stoical eyes of middle-aged firemen, of autistic children crushed in rear-end collisions, their eyes less wounded in death, of buses filled with mental defectives drowning together stoically in the roadside industrial canals.